By the winter of 1944, the German Reich resembled a gambler deep in debt, borrowing from imaginary reserves and praying for divine intervention. The Ardennes Offensive, more romantically known as the Battle of the Bulge, was the last grand bluff of a regime already collapsing under the weight of its own fantasies. It was a campaign conceived not in the cold calculations of strategy, but in the feverish mind of a man convinced that willpower could replace oil, and faith could substitute for logistics. The plan was simple in theory, which is often the first warning sign of impending disaster. 500,000 men, 450,000 in the initial strike, with 70,000 more in reserve, were to smash through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, seize Antwerp, and drive a wedge between the British and American armies. The goal was to sow panic, fracture Allied unity, and perhaps, in some miracle of delusion, force a negotiated peace in the West. The operation was to unfold with all the elegance of Blitzkrieg's early triumphs. Reality, however, had long since divorced itself from Hitler's imagination. Even a cursory glance at Germany's situation by late 1944 revealed a nation strangled by exhaustion. The Romanian oil fields were gone. Allied bombers had turned refineries into infernos, and fuel reserves had become a quaint memory. What remained of the Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions relied on the absurd hope of capturing Allied gasoline along the way. It was as if an army had set out to conquer Europe with half a tank of gas and a prayer. The geography of the Ardennes itself conspired against this delusion. It was a landscape of forests, narrow roads and villages where tanks queued like disgruntled commuters. The Germans, who once prided themselves on operational precision, found themselves idling in miles-long traffic jams while precious fuel evaporated. To make matters worse, the weather, a key part of the plan, turned against them. The winter fog that was supposed to hide them from Allied air power instead reduced their mobility to a crawl. The Grand Offensive became an overblown traffic accident conducted in sub-zero temperatures. Yet the plan was not without audacity. The Germans intended to recapture the spirit of 1940, when tanks had sliced through France in days, and the enemy collapsed under the illusion of unstoppable momentum. But the Germany of 1944 was not the same creature. The Wehrmacht's vaunted divisions were now a patchwork of veterans clinging to memories, and conscripts barely old enough to shave. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, existed mostly on paper. Its pilots were green, its fuel scarce, its aircraft grounded as often as not. The new Blitzkrieg was being launched with the ghost of an army and the fumes of an air force. The Americans, meanwhile, were the supposed lambs to the slaughter, undertrained, undersupplied, and blissfully unaware of what was coming. Hitler had chosen his target well, at least in theory. The Ardennes was held by units deemed too inexperienced for major action, ideal prey for his last offensive. Yet even this calculation revealed the fatal hubris of the German High Command. The Allies, unlike the Germans, had reserves to spare. Their supply lines were long, but their fuel and ammunition flowed in endless abundance. Once the initial surprise wore off, the balance would shift decisively and irrevocably. Indeed, the offensive's only true success was its surprise. On December 16, 1944, the German guns opened fire, and, for a brief moment, it seemed that the impossible might happen. The American lines buckled, confusion reigned, and panic rippled through headquarters from Saint-Vite to Bastogne. In the first days, the German spearheads advanced nearly 80 kilometers, a remarkable feat under the circumstances. But the brilliance of a sprint means little when the marathon is unwinnable. The plan required reaching Antwerp in a week. The Meuse River, halfway there, was to be crossed by day 4. These timetables belonged to fantasy. Even if the Germans had advanced twice as fast as they did, their fuel stocks would not have carried them to the coast. And every hour of delay gave the Allies time to react. Eisenhower grasped the situation almost immediately. No local attack could explain the scale of the assault. Reinforcements began moving within hours, and by the time the German spearheads approached the Meuse, they were outnumbered. Hitler's generals knew it too. In the planning sessions preceding the offensive, nearly all of them had expressed doubts. Antwerp, they argued, was too ambitious a target. Fuel stocks were insufficient, supply lines unreliable, and the terrain hostile. Some proposed more limited operations to delay the Allied advance or secure defensive ground. But Hitler, in his characteristic disdain for reality, dismissed them all. He demanded a strike so bold that even his generals could scarcely believe he was serious. He envisioned American soldiers collapsing at the sight of his panzers, British morale crumbling, and the Western Allies suing for peace, while Germany turned eastward to save Europe from Bolshevism. It was delusion raised to the level of grand strategy. The irony, of course, is that much of the German army performed admirably under circumstances that should have broken them outright. The defenders they faced were indeed green, but so were many of their attackers. Yet the Americans, stubborn as ever, held on in isolated pockets that defied the logic of the battlefield. Bastogne became the symbol of this obstinate resistance, a small Belgian town encircled, shelled, and starved, yet refusing to surrender. Each of these tiny acts of defiance delayed the German timetable further. A destroyed bridge here, a platoon of engineers there. Each minute gained was another nail in the offensive's coffin. The chaos was total. German columns snarled behind burned-out vehicles. Commanders lost contact with their own units. Supply trucks wandered into the wrong sectors. Even success became a liability, as fast-moving vanguards outpaced their fuel convoys and found themselves stranded. The Wehrmacht, once a master of operational art, now resembled a man running headlong into a brick wall, determined, impressive, and completely doomed. When the weather finally cleared, Allied air power descended like divine judgment. What the Germans feared most became their final undoing. Fighter bombers hunted convoys, strafed columns, and turned every daylight movement into a massacre. The Luftwaffe tried one last desperate act, Operation Bodenplatte, a massive raid on Allied airfields. It achieved momentary shock, but at catastrophic cost. The last trained German pilots were killed, and with them, the last pretense that the Reich could control its own skies. In the end, the German army retreated much as it had advanced, chaotically, with courage wasted on futility. The offensive that was meant to change the course of the war instead accelerated its conclusion. Hitler had burned through his last reserves of fuel, manpower, and hope. The battle that was to divide the Allies instead united them more firmly than ever. The bulge in the Allied line became a monument to the futility of fighting for a cause already lost. Yet there remains a dark magnificence in the attempt itself. A final, deranged echo of the old German genius for war. It was a campaign fought by men who knew they were dying, for a cause already in ashes, commanded by a leader who mistook stubbornness for strategy. The Battle of the Bulge stands as both an operational fiasco and a psychological portrait. The moment when the Third Reich, already mortally wounded, decided to commit strategic suicide with style. For all its audacity, the offensive was never a battle for victory. It was a battle for illusion. Hitler was no longer fighting the Allies. He was fighting history itself. And history, indifferent to his tantrums, rolled on. The soldiers who froze to death in the Ardennes. The tank crews stranded in forests without fuel. The generals forced to mouth optimism they did not feel. All of them were casualties not merely of war, but of one man's refusal to accept the end. When the last German tanks withdrew, and the bulge in the Allied line flattened once more, it was clear to anyone with eyes that Germany had fired its final shot. The Third Reich had reached the end of its capacity to delude itself. The miracle weapons, the counter-offensives, the talk of turning the tide, all had dissolved into snow and smoke. The Ardennes Offensive did not fail because the Americans were lucky or brave, though they were both. It failed because Germany had already lost long before the first shell fell. It was, at its core, a funeral march masquerading as a victory parade. The Third Reich, by the middle years of the Second World War, was a masterpiece of unsustainable ambition. Its armies still marched, its factories still smoked, and its Führer still shouted about victory. But the machinery beneath the noise was breaking apart in slow motion. By 1944, Germany's war effort had become a grotesque parody of its former self, a military juggernaut powered by propaganda, fantasy, and dwindling barrels of synthetic fuel. The world had once trembled at the sight of German efficiency. Now it merely marveled at German denial. What had begun as the most disciplined war machine in modern history had degenerated into an exhausted giant, propped up by teenagers, bureaucratic improvisation, and increasingly desperate lies. Even the architects of the Reich's earlier victories, men who had once made history quake, had begun to whisper that the game was over. Hitler, of course, disagreed. He saw defeat as a moral failing rather than a logistical one, and so he ordered his armies to believe in miracles as fervently as they once believed in strategy. The first great casualty of German overreach was oil. When the Romanian fields at Ploiesti fell to the Soviets, the Wehrmacht effectively lost its bloodstream. Germany had never possessed sufficient natural petroleum to sustain mechanized warfare. During the early years, this problem had been masked by plunder, oil from captured depots, refineries seized in conquered territories, and the occasional success of synthetic fuel production. But war, like fire, consumes faster than it creates. By late 1944, tanks were fighting on fumes, and air squadrons were grounded not by the enemy, but by arithmetic. The irony was painful. Germany had pioneered the concept of mechanized lightning war, and then spent the rest of the conflict dying by its own invention. The Blitzkrieg had been built on speed, on columns of tanks that struck deep and fast, crushing slower armies through shock and coordination. But speed requires fuel, and fuel requires planning. The Wehrmacht's logistical brilliance, once its greatest weapon, became its Achilles heel when the Reich could no longer feed its own engines. A nation that once conquered continents by calculation now stumbled through the mud by improvisation. While Hitler dreamed of fresh offensives, his generals were busy reclassifying what combat-ready meant. Divisions that would once have been withdrawn for rest or replacement were kept at the front until they disintegrated. The elite formations of 1939 were gone, buried, captured, or scattered across battlefields from Stalingrad to Normandy. Their replacements were a patchwork of what Germany still had left to spend. Old men, teenagers, and half-trained conscripts dressed in uniforms that no longer fit. Even the Waffen-SS, once paraded as the model of Nazi martial virtue, was quietly replenished with conscripts who lacked both zeal and ammunition. The Luftwaffe's story was equally tragicomic. Once the symbol of German technological dominance, by 1944 it was a corpse, propped up in uniform. Allied bombing had destroyed the fuel depots that kept the planes aloft, while the airfields themselves had become hunting grounds for enemy fighters. New aircraft rolled off the production lines faster than pilots could be trained to fly them, and faster than the Reich could refuel them once they were airborne. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's suicidal New Year's Day raid in 1945, encapsulated this madness. Hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft thrown into the teeth of Allied air power, in a gesture that achieved little beyond accelerating Germany's final collapse. It was less a strategy than a tantrum. This exhaustion was not merely physical. It was moral. For years, Hitler had kept his generals in line by invoking the mythology of invincibility. That German genius, properly motivated, could defy mathematics. But even fanaticism cannot refill an empty gas tank. The Wehrmacht's commanders understood that their problem was not courage, but calculus. They were outproduced, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Allied factories, immune to bombing and fed by endless resources, were churning out tanks, trucks, and planes at a scale no European nation could hope to match. The United States alone was producing more war material than all Axis powers combined. Germany had been fighting a total war with partial means. Now the bill had come due. Hitler's response to this reality was characteristically elegant. He ignored it. He dismissed the advice of his generals as cowardice, insisted that offensive spirit could substitute for steel, and accused anyone who spoke of retreat of treason. He had once been a gambler with an uncanny instinct for opportunity. By 1944, he had become a gambler who refused to leave the table long after the house had repossessed his chair. The result was a strategic schizophrenia that baffled even his own commanders. On one front, he ordered total mobilization and scorched earth defense. On another, he demanded grandiose offensives to turn the tide. Each new decisive operation drained what little strength remained. Hitler's fixation on holding every inch of ground turned retreat into massacre, and defense into attrition. Towns were declared fortresses not because they could be defended, but because he refused to admit they could be lost. The result was a string of self-imposed disasters, miniature Stalingrads scattered across Europe. The Allies, meanwhile, were learning. American and British artillery had evolved into an art form, coordinated, flexible, and lethally precise. When the Germans attacked, they faced not just soldiers, but a machine of industrialized response. American proximity-fused shells, introduced quietly during the Ardennes, turned every assault into a massacre. German troops who once mocked the supposed softness of their opponents now found themselves buried under a storm of steel called in by radio within minutes. It was not gallantry that defeated them. It was logistics, that most unromantic of military virtues. The Reich's leadership could not, or would not, grasp this transformation. They spoke of morale, destiny, and fate, while the Allies spoke of tonnage, production schedules, and fuel distribution. One side worshipped myth, the other worshipped supply chains. History, unsurprisingly, sided with the accountants. Even on the home front, exhaustion was absolute. The war economy, supposedly total, was running on borrowed time. Civilian morale had long since curdled into fatalism. The cities burned nightly under Allied bombing raids that the Luftwaffe could no longer contest. Rail lines were shattered, factories reduced to rubble, and the countryside stripped bare for conscription and production. Albert Speer, the ever-efficient architect of Hitler's industrial dreams, managed for a time to keep the illusion alive through ruthless rationalization. But even Speer's genius could not conjure oil out of thin air or soldiers from the ashes of Stalingrad. And yet, the regime persisted, driven less by hope than by hysteria. To stop fighting was unthinkable, because stopping would mean acknowledging defeat, And defeat would mean the end not just of the war, but of the myth itself. The Nazis had built their empire on the promise of eternal victory. Surrender would render the entire ideology meaningless. Thus, every new disaster was rebranded as heroic resistance. Every retreat became a planned repositioning. The final act of self-delusion was linguistic. The Reich was collapsing, but its reports still spoke of temporary setbacks and fortified morale. The irony deepened when even Hitler's enemies began to understand the futility better than he did. Allied commanders were astonished by the tenacity of German resistance, by the refusal to surrender when all logic demanded it. But it was not courage, it was compulsion. The Wehrmacht had been trained to obey, and obedience had long since replaced belief. The German soldier fought on, not out of faith in victory, but because there was nowhere left to go. By the time of the Ardennes Offensive, this exhaustion had curdled into pathology. The plan to reach Antwerp was not merely unrealistic, it was suicidal. Even if the Germans had succeeded, even if their panzers had somehow rolled into the port city, it would have changed nothing. The Soviets were already closing in from the east with overwhelming force. The Reich's factories were dying, its population starving, and its cities disappearing under carpet bombing. Antwerp could have been conquered in a miracle, and Germany would still have lost the war in a month. The offensive was not designed to win. It was designed to delay the inevitable. It was, in essence, an act of strategic necromancy, Hitler's attempt to resurrect a dead army by sheer will. But empires do not die cleanly. They decay in stages, shedding their illusions one by one, until all that remains is inertia. The German war machine, once the envy of the world, had become a grim parody of itself, an empire of improvisation, fighting battles it could not afford to win or lose. The miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the whispered atomic projects, were monuments to delusion, designed less to change the war than to distract from the fact that it was already over. And still the orders came. Children were armed and sent to the front. The Volkssturm, old men with rifles and boys barely in their teens, were declared the final line of defense. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had terrified continents, now shared its trenches with the remnants of the Hitler youth. This was not strategy. It was a nation consuming itself. By the dawn of 1945, Germany was no longer fighting for victory, but for the privilege of dying dramatically. The Reich had become addicted to its own tragedy. In a sense, Hitler had achieved his ideal of total war, not in the triumph of German arms, but in the total destruction of Germany itself. Every factory bombed, every city flattened, every soldier sacrificed served his final purpose: to prove that he had never been wrong, only betrayed. The empire of exhaustion had reached its logical conclusion. The Wehrmacht's tanks were motionless, not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. The Luftwaffe's pilots were grounded, not by fear, but by arithmetic. The soldiers still fought, but their rifles were aimed at ghosts. Ghosts of past victories, of vanished glory, of a world that no longer existed. The Third Reich had promised 1,000 years. It barely survived 12. Every war produces a final moment when the outcome becomes obvious to all but those too invested in denial to see it. For Germany, that moment came early, perhaps as early as 1941, though it would take 4 more catastrophic years, millions of deaths, and the destruction of an entire continent for reality to be accepted. The Third Reich's tragedy was not merely that it lost, it was that it refused to admit the loss, long after logic, logistics, and life itself had fled the field. The myth of German invincibility began to crack in the snows outside Moscow. What was meant to be the swift annihilation of the Soviet Union, the crowning triumph of Hitler's vision, became instead a monument to hubris. Operation Barbarossa had begun as the largest military invasion in human history. It ended as a logistical nightmare. The Wehrmacht, stretched across thousands of kilometers, found itself starved of fuel, supplies, and winter gear. Hitler had gambled everything on a short war. He got the Russian winter instead. By December 1941, German troops were dying by the thousands in sub-zero temperatures, their vehicles frozen solid, their generals begging for retreat. The war was effectively lost that winter. The rest was denial, disguised as strategy. The defeat before Moscow destroyed the illusion that Germany could fight on two fronts. Yet the Reich did exactly that, and then, in a fit of monumental arrogance, added a third. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. It was an act of geopolitical suicide so pure in its absurdity that it almost defies parody. Germany, already bogged down in the Soviet Union and barely holding in North Africa, decided to challenge the single largest industrial power in the world. The Führer had mistaken the United States for another European state, an error of perception that would soon be corrected by a tidal wave of tanks, ships, and aircraft. If the German High Command had any collective sense of irony, it died at Stalingrad. That city, which Hitler had chosen for no greater reason than its name, became the graveyard of his empire's ambitions. The encirclement of the Sixth Army in the winter of 1942–43 was not merely a tactical disaster. It was a spiritual one. For the first time, the Nazi regime could not explain away defeat. There was no strategic withdrawal, no planned redeployment. There was only surrender, humiliating, undeniable, and complete. Nearly 300,000 men went into the cauldron. Fewer than 100,000 returned, most of them in Soviet captivity. The defeat shattered the myth of German invulnerability. Yet even then, Hitler refused to change course. The Eastern Front, he insisted, was merely a temporary setback. It would, of course, never recover. The German generals knew the truth. Many of them, trained professionals steeped in the arithmetic of war, recognized by 1942 that victory was no longer possible. Their diaries and reports, preserved in archives and court-martials alike, reveal a pervasive fatalism. Officers wrote of dwindling fuel, of irreplaceable losses, of battles fought only to delay the inevitable. Some even attempted to persuade Hitler to negotiate, or at least shorten his objectives. He responded as he always did, with accusations of cowardice and betrayal. To question victory was treason. To speak of peace was blasphemy, and so the generals obeyed, sending their men to die for an outcome they no longer believed in. By 1943, the Reich was trapped in a grim arithmetic. The Allies had seized the initiative on every front. In North Africa, Rommel's once vaunted Africa Corps was crushed between British and American armies. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist dream collapsed like a stage prop, forcing Germany to occupy its own allies' territory. In the skies, the Allied bombing campaign reduced German cities to rubble, dismantling the industrial base piece by piece. The very tactics that had once terrified Europe, speed, surprise, coordination, were now being used against their inventor. Blitzkrieg had come home. The turning point, if one can call it that, came at Kursk in the summer of 1943. It was the last great offensive the Wehrmacht would ever launch in the East, and it was crushed before it began. The Red Army, better equipped, better supplied, and no longer intimidated, met the German panzers head-on and annihilated them in the largest tank battle in history. The offensive collapsed. The Soviet counterattack surged westward, and with it, the last illusion of German supremacy vanished. From that point onward, Germany would never again choose where or when to fight. The rest of the war was merely retreat dressed as defiance. And yet, the charade continued. The Nazi state had always depended on myth to sustain itself, and it was determined to go down believing its own propaganda. The miracle weapons, the rockets, the jets, the whispered atomic projects, were not weapons of victory, but of self-deception. They served as symbols, promising salvation through technology, while reality burned. Each new prototype was paraded as proof that destiny had not yet abandoned the fatherland. Meanwhile, factories crumbled, railways failed, and cities vanished under firestorms. Even the people, long conditioned to obedience, began to see through the veil. They could hear the thunder of Allied bombers, see the glow of their cities burning, and yet were told that victory was assured. The word itself had become meaningless, like a prayer uttered by habit. Hitler, secluded in his underground sanctuaries, spoke of turning points long after the map on his wall had ceased to represent reality. His speeches grew more detached, his tone alternating between megalomania and despair. To the end, he remained convinced that history would vindicate him. It did, in a sense, just not in the way he imagined. When the Western Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the final curtain began to fall. The Reich's once formidable Atlantic War collapsed in weeks. French resistance fighters rose from the underground, and the Wehrmacht, already hollowed out by losses, found itself retreating on every front. The Western Offensive was not just a military operation. It was the visible proof that the war was lost. Yet Hitler's orders remained unchanged. No retreat, no surrender, no reality. His generals obeyed, as they always had, even when obedience meant annihilation. The subsequent months were a study in futility. The Allies advanced inexorably from the west, the Soviets from the east. And still, the Reich refused to die quietly. Every town became a fortress, every delay a victory. By late 1944, the German army was fighting not for triumph, but for the illusion of honor. The Battle of the Bulge, the last great offensive, was, in retrospect, not a military operation at all, but a performance. The Empire's final act of theater, before its inevitable collapse. It is tempting to ask when, precisely, Germany knew it had lost, but the more accurate question is, when did it choose to admit it? For the ordinary soldier freezing on the Eastern Front, the truth was clear by the winter of 1942. For the industrialists and bureaucrats, it was evident when Allied bombs began leveling the cities in 1943. For the generals, it was undeniable after Kursk. But for Hitler, and therefore for the Reich, it was never. He had built his state on the premise that belief could conquer fact. To acknowledge defeat would be to destroy the ideological architecture that held the entire regime together. And so the war continued into absurdity. By 1945, the German army was conscripting boys of 14 and men of 60. The Volkssturm was less a defense force than a national suicide pact. Children with Panzerfausts were sent to ambush tanks. Old men with World War I rifles were told to defend cities that no longer existed. It was less a military strategy than a public confession of madness. The Third Reich had become the very thing it claimed to despise. A nation ruled by weakness, fighting not for life, but for the privilege of a theatrical death. Even the question of surrender was treated as a moral crime. When some generals finally dared to suggest negotiation, Hitler accused them of treachery. He preferred total destruction to compromise. "If the German people cannot win this war," he raged, "then they deserve to perish." It was not leadership. It was nihilism disguised as patriotism. The man who had promised to make Germany great again would instead make it extinct. When Berlin finally fell in April 1945, the war's last act played out like a grotesque parody of its beginning. Hitler, the architect of destruction, hid beneath the ruins of his own capital, ranting about betrayal and vengeance, while the city above him disintegrated. His once mighty armies were now scattered bands of starving survivors. The Luftwaffe no longer flew. The panzers no longer rolled. The Reich that had promised a millennium collapsed before it reached adolescence. What makes this ending so remarkable is not its inevitability, but the stubborn refusal to accept it. Even as Soviet shells landed on the Reich chancellery, orders were still being issued for divisions that no longer existed. The radio continued to broadcast victory bulletins to a population that no longer had homes. The illusion of control endured until the final moment, when Hitler took his own life, rather than face the world he had destroyed. In that moment, the long defeat ended. Not because Germany surrendered, but because its delusion finally did. History's verdict on the Third Reich is absolute, but it is also instructive. The war was lost, not merely on the battlefield, but in the mind. From the first invasion to the last retreat, the regime mistook belief for strength and willpower for strategy. Its leaders treated reality as negotiable and logistics as an insult to genius. In the end, they proved that no ideology, however ruthless or disciplined, can outlast the simple arithmetic of war. When the factories stop, the fuel runs out, and the soldiers vanish, no amount of faith can fill the void. The long defeat of Germany was therefore not a single event, but a process, a slow unraveling of myth. It began when the Wehrmacht failed to take Moscow, deepened at Stalingrad, and became irreversible at Kursk. The rest was spectacle. The Ardennes, the miracle weapons, the desperate final battles. All were symptoms of a state that had lost the ability to distinguish defiance from delusion. By the time Hitler's empire collapsed, its defeat had long been written in the laws of mathematics, geography, and human endurance. In the ruins of Berlin, as the smoke cleared and the flags changed, the world finally saw what had been obvious for years, that the 1,000-year Reich had died of exhaustion and pride. Its armies had fought bravely, often brilliantly, but always in service of a fantasy that could not survive contact with reality. The Reich's greatest enemy was never the Allies or the Soviets. It was the myth of its own infallibility. And so ends the most spectacular suicide in modern history, a nation that mistook fury for greatness and perished in the attempt to prove itself eternal. The ruins it left behind stand as monuments not only to the horror of its crimes, but to the futility of its denial. The lesson, though often ignored, is simple. No empire collapses suddenly. It dies in stages, one delusion at a time. Thanks for watching. Subscribe Haki Talk.